the first video on teachers and teaching. There are many different ways we could be talking about teaching. We could talk about teaching as a profession, teaching as just a job, teaching as teaching methodologies or pedagogies, how one learns to be a teacher, so teacher training, how one becomes a teacher, such as qualifications, government policies about teaching and teaching, such as quality control and accountability, and so on. The main focus today will be on learning to teach, but I'll touch on a couple of the other things as well. In terms of educational philosophies and methodologies, methods of teaching have generally been based around the idea of schooling being subject-centered versus child-centered. So there's been a shift from subject-centered education to child-centered education, which has had much to do with the development of psychology and new understandings of children and how children learn. The historian Charles E. Phillips outlines the general methods of teaching in the following way. From 1800 to about 1850, it was all about textbook assignment. You just assigned readings from a textbook and that was it. Then the 1850 to about 1875, there was this transition to sort of a classroom-based teaching and less about the textbooks. 1875 to 1900, there was different techniques like pressure technique, which was a way of, expecting children to learn by testing, like placing them under pressure to answer questions quickly and spontaneously. In the early 20th century is when we start to see transitions to what we would call more modern methods, where the evolution of child psychology and the psychology of teaching and so on starts to evolve. And then 1925 to 50, what they called modern methods was the norm. And then after the 1950s, you start to see more child-centered and holistic methods of teaching. And then by the 1990s, we start to see a return to sort of more subject-centered types of teaching. These are things that we still see a little bit of today, especially in this sort of neoliberal era. There is this sort of subject-centered idea of teaching, especially in the high school grades, but holistic methods still continue to persist, especially in, kindergartens and the early years. So today we could say that we have a blend of pedagogies. And this is partly because there's been this tension between research that shows holistic methods are really good for teaching kids more about the holistic methods are good for teaching kids about more than just the memory types of skills, right? So book learning and subject-based learning is better for memory-based types of skills, where learning about critical thinking and problem solving and so on is actually best done holistically. There's those kinds of differences. Memory type skills are important, of course, because we also know that repetition helps you to remember stuff. The more times you see it, the more likely you are to remember it, and so often. But that can be done in a holistic manner, not just drill and kill. So if we think about teaching, I want you to think, as we go through these slides, think about this question: what makes a good teacher? Is it knowledge? Is it personality, sense of humor, fairness? Is it ability to teach well? Is it the ability to inspire students? Or is it all of these things? If so, how do we measure them? How do we measure these qualities? That question of being able to measure the qualities leads to things like accountability efforts. We can also ask, how do we teach these things? Which, of course, is teacher training. And we can ask the question of, how do we know who will be a good teacher? Who gets to become a teacher? And who gets to become the good teachers? These questions also beg a few others. How much education should a teacher have? How much should teachers get paid? What should their working conditions be like? And so on. In addition to this are the things like what can be taught, methodologies, how paperwork and accountability should take place, how should teachers follow curriculum, what are the classroom management strategies, and all of these things are also sort of underneath a lot of what we're going to be talking about here. Prior to the 1840s, virtually anyone who could read and write and do simple sums at a very bare minimum could be hired to teach. There were no regulations. Teachers in these early years also often had poor reputations. Sometimes there were these they had this reputation, this image of being these drunken men who were, couldn't hold down any other kind of job. Or maybe a flip motto was, or a flip idea was that it was the young girls who were barely older than her students. These were the types of people that were often the only teachers available. Because young girls, they get older and get married and then they're not allowed to teach. Young men can make more money doing other kinds of jobs. The job was truly poorly paid. And teachers really had nowhere else to live except they were expected to board with families in the community. So if they weren't teaching in their own home community, there was a term that they called boarded around. So they might spend 1 month with one family and then another month with the next family and another month with a third family. So every month you're moving from home to home. Now these 19th century rules that I'm just going to show you now were more about dealing with these poorly trained teachers rather than about good teaching practices. So it was rules about what teachers had to do each day, like fill the lamps, right? So oil lamps. They had to clean the chimneys of the lamps. Each day, each teacher will bring a bucket of water and a scuttle of coal for the day's sessions. Men teachers may take one evening a week for courting purposes, or 2 evenings a week if they go to church regularly. So really controlling activities outside the school as well. After 10 hours in school, the teacher may spend the remaining time reading the Bible or other good books. So they were expected not to have a social life at all. Women teachers who marry or engage in unseemly conduct will be dismissed. Every teacher should lay aside from each pay a goodly sum of earnings for his benefit during his declining years so that he will not become a burden on society. In other words, you had to set aside some money for when you retired, right? Eventually, the early forms of teachers' unions came together primarily to create a fund for retired teachers. Any teacher who smokes, uses liquor in any form, frequents pool or public halls, or gets shaves in a barber shop will give good reason to suspect his worth, intention, and honesty. All those things were considered to be a sign of bad character. Any teacher who performs his labor faithfully and without fault for 5 years will be given an increase of 25 cents per week in his pay, providing the Board of Education approves. So that just gives you a sense of what the expectations were for a teacher. Now I want to talk a little bit about learning to teach. In the era before the 1840s, like I said, the expectations for teachers was pretty strict in the sense of how they were to act, but there was not a lot about what teachers had to know. And by the end of the 1830s and the early 1840s, it had become obvious to educational reformers and the people that believed education should be promoted. These people believed that the number of trained teachers was inadequate to meet public demands. Egerton Ryerson, who we've mentioned before, called for the training of teachers in order to raise their professional status. He believed that there could not be good schools without good teachers who were trained for the profession. And he believed that centrally controlled teacher training would form the cornerstone of the education system of the province. Before this time, there was really no formal option for the training of teachers in Upper Canada. Any teachers that had been trained usually came from other countries. They'd been trained prior to immigrating. But the vast majority of teachers had had no formal training. In 1846, which was a significant year for teacher training in Upper Canada, in 1846, the British Parliament passed an Act for the Better Establishment and Maintenance of Common Schools in Upper Canada. With this act, a system of teacher certification was initiated. Teachers were to complete standardized merit examinations, and their salaries, if they passed them, their salaries would be augmented by the government. The Act also called for the establishment and state funding of a provincial normal school for the formal training of elementary school teachers. And this normal school was opened in 1847. Now, the word normal, it sounds funny to call a teacher training schools normal schools, but normal signifies or meant, quote, according to rule or principle, end quote. So a normal school was a school in which the principles and practice of teaching, according to rules, were taught and exemplified. I'm going to pause here to break up the videos, and we'll continue this in a second video.